Hi folks, something a little different today. I thought I'd talk a bit about the barn that's here on our land, our farm. This was built, as you can see by the sign there, we think in 1870. Oh, somebody's target shooting, sorry about the extra noise. By my great-great-grandfather, the first owner of our farm back in, well, they got it in like 1860. But we think it was about 1870. There was another barn in the foreground where I'm standing before that, but that's been long gone. I've seen old pictures of it. But this is a very typical type of barn for this part of the Northeast, very similar to other Pennsylvania German farms. It's called a bank barn. As you can see there, the ground slopes up so that you can run wagons up into it to put grain or hay or whatever you're going to store on the top of the barn. And then there's a floor that is under grade in the back, and the sides it isn't, where the stable was. You can see a little bit there with the foundation masonry where that corner is. The slope, the dirt didn't go all the way to the corner. It wasn't necessary over there because they mostly wanted it where you're going to be using the wagons and so on to get in and out. 4 main doors on a track, a barn door track, as you can see. Now my son did a lot of work on this barn, probably 15, maybe 12 years ago. He repainted the doors, he put the white trim around the red. There wasn't any of that on there. He put the sign on, and maybe 12 years ago or so he had this side. He hired it done. He had the metal roof put on. A company came in and did it. The southern face, that's the southern face that you're looking at. The shingles just got to be too bad, and it was leaking pretty badly. So he had that done. The north face hasn't been done, and it does need to be done. Originally, I'll walk while I talk here. Hopefully the camera will stay in focus. Originally, the side of the barn. Oh no, we got an airplane flying over too. It's a busy Sunday afternoon. The sides of the barn were what they called board and batten. They had vertical planks that provided the siding. The framing inside is barn framing, of course. And then to cover the seams between them, because they were maybe, I don't know, a foot, 15-inch planks, depending. And then they would put thinner strips, maybe 2-3 inches wide, also vertically, to cover over the seams so that it wouldn't, air wouldn't come through and water wouldn't come in. Typical board and batten. But about, I think it's a bit over 50 years now, my grandmother, when she had a roof put on here, it was a shingled roof, she also had the contractors put red shingles on the walls. All the walls around here are shingled too. They're getting pretty rough now after 50 years, but they held up pretty decently considering. And they're just asphalt roofing shingles that she put on, again, to protect it, to keep it from, being damaged and so on. And that's the way it was. Now, I'll take you for a look inside and also in the top here and also down in the stable. The dimensions on this thing are approximately 70 feet long by about, I'll show you some of the other features here. I'll do the outside before we go in. By about 40 feet wide, as you can see. And these other structures, first of all, this lean-to my son put on, that wasn't there until maybe, like I said, 12, 15 years ago. He added that so he could have more room for storage for his farm equipment. This cinder block addition was added around, I believe it was 1961 is what we think, when my father was trying to convert the farm from an old-fashioned farm to a more modern dairy farm. This was the milk house. Now he was about 3 or 4 years ahead of his time because he didn't figure on a stainless steel bulk tank to store the milk. It was right, this was right before those things became popular and the farmers started to use them. He actually had milk cans and water bath coolers. He had 2 water bath coolers in there. They ran on electricity, and they would hold, I think each of them held maybe 4 30-gallon milk cans. So when he would accumulate enough milk, then he'd take the milk cans to the dairy that was just a few miles away. And that was how he did it. But of course, that didn't last too long because all the other farmers in the area went to the vacuum lines, glass vacuum lines, and a bulk tank to store their milk in. He did have not vacuum lines, a feed line, the feed lines that the milk would run through. He did have a vacuum system with galvanized pipe that provided the suction for the electric milking machines, and then that's the way he operated with that. Now, he also put this additional stable on, again, around the same time, around 1961. I can barely remember it as a kid. This was to add another, I think it had 12 or 14 stalls for cattle. And this other concrete block work here was added, as a typical bank barn was, and it's hard to see now. I can show you inside a bit. The front was actually cantilevered. This face here came out beyond the original foundation, the original wall, support walls, by about 5-6 feet. And so what that meant was it was like a covered entrance to the stable below, and then you had the typical barn doors, the 2-part barn doors, so that animals could get in and out in the dry, also that the rain didn't blow right into the stable. It was just the architectural style they used. But when he added this extra construction, he just eliminated that because it wasn't necessary anymore. This was an original, somebody had originally painted this. My son salvaged it from storage up in the top of the barn. This was a multi-pane window that was in there, similar to the one you just saw there by the milk house originally, to provide light. But and then here you can see there were several windows. He's replaced some of those from what was in here originally. There were 2 doors like this that opened to the upper floor of the barn. There's one on the other side. This made getting hay into the barn, or even hay out of the barn, easy. I know when he was selling hay here, if he had a customer, he'd just, instead of having them back up to the back, it was just as easy to back the truck underneath the door and drop the hay bales right down onto it this way. But they used it for a number of reasons, I'm sure. But that was just the style of this type of barn. Again, 40 by 70, and it was huge for its day because they just didn't have, in the 1800s, they didn't have that many cattle. I'll take you both upstairs and downstairs to show you a little bit of some of the other features there. It's pretty unique architecture, and the fact that it stood now for, what are we talking, 155 years is pretty impressive, I think. So I'll come back to you with the next. Okay, here I am inside the top of the barn. It's basically just a junk collector now for storage. We don't have any cattle, and we're not producing any kind of hay crops. There's been some work done here over the years. Originally that louver was not at the top, and where you see those 3 darker boards, that was actually a window there. Why they put a window where there was hay, I'm sure it was for ventilation, but the concern is if it could catch fire. This cable that's running here, in about the 1960s, a contractor put this in to make sure that the walls couldn't push out too far. With it aging, and you fill this full, it kind of tended to bulge, and this cable was taut when the barn was full of hay. You can see the barn framing here, and if you look closely, let's see if I can get in close enough for you to be able to see. All these framing members were mortise and tenon, where they actually notched the beams. And if you look right up in there, you can see they're pegged. They were held together with wooden pegs. Back in the day, that's what they used. heavy-duty steel bolts and frames weren't as easily accessible on a farm. It was simple to do this, and it worked. They had to use hand drills to drill through there. They'd have to use hand chisels to cut out the mortise and tendon and other saws, and then they'd put it together that way. You can see the cross members there for support, and up at the top, same thing. And you can see the size of these beams. I'll try to give you a rough idea. I'll put my hand here so you can see just about how big these main beams are. I mean, it's massive. And I am not an expert on some woods. I don't know if this is, it's not oak, and it's not maple. I don't know if this is more of a yellow pine or perhaps even American chestnut. Early America, they used a lot of chestnut wood for building because it was strong, it was light, it was a whole lot easier to work with than oak. And this would have been before the blight happened at the turn of the early part of the 1900s, the early part of the 20th century. You can see the board planking here. Now this piece is probably 15 inches across. This is more like 12. There was nothing standard. They used what they had, and I am fairly certain that all of the wood in this barn came from this farm. They had a sawmill here. It would have made more sense for them to cut it themselves, dry it themselves, and use it rather than try to buy it from somebody. It wouldn't have been as much available, and it wasn't built by a contractor. It was built by my ancestors. And see over the years all the mud wasps and other kind of wasps that have come in here. These newer boards, this 2x lumber, this rough cut 2x lumber, my son put in here. He was trying to reinforce things. I'll show you on the other side. He got a bit further than he did here. He put some uprights on the other side to just make sure that it would stay strong for many years to come. But as you can see, the amount of work that went into this is pretty amazing. All of those rafters are rough cut but planed lumber. They're not just logs. And as you can see here, there you can see there's a little bit of separation in the mortise and tendon. So he tried to reinforce that with some planking on the other side. But if you look there, you can see the pegs sticking out pretty clearly. And even in the upper one there, you can see them sticking out. If you look up in there, you can see there's a chain hanging from the rafters, and there's one on the far end, and there's one right above us right here. They didn't have balers back then. So how do you deal with loose hay? Well, you run a piece of rope up through that. Don't ask me how they got up there to do it. And then you would back the hay wagon in with loose hay in it, and you would had a hay hook on the end of the rope, and it would come down and kind of grapple a large pile of hay, and then you could pull it up and kind of swing it into position. That's how they filled the barn at the time, before the advent of mechanical balers. So that's still up there for now. I don't know, it'll probably never be removed as long as the barn stands. Most of this is milled lumber. You can see a little bit on that beam there. There's some chinking where they used an adze or a draw knife, I'm not sure which, to try to round a log or to square up a log. So there was some primitive work that was done on here as well. I'll come back to you in a minute. I'll take you to the other side and show you another feature that was part of this barn as well. In this bay, and there were 4 bays up here, this bay you can see there's some better quality wood on the floor. It's tongue and groove rather than just rough cut planking. This was known as the threshing floor, the granary floor, and this is where sometimes they'd bring their shocks of grain in here and beat them off, and it needed to be tighter and better so that they wouldn't lose any kernels of grain, obviously. And then for whatever reason just this one section had that. Another feature here is, you can see my son had all kinds of posters in here. This little room here was the granary. This is where they would actually store the grain. See, there's another horse painting that somebody made. There would be just these little bins here. I have this door open here from what I said was over on the other side. You can see they had these little granary bins, and they would store the grain in here. They were designed that you could add boards as you got more grain until it was all the way up to the top of this level. They still had to keep some airflow through here so that the grain wouldn't get too hot and cause a fire, or even get too much humidity and end up molding. But this was the granary. Again, you can see it's a much better quality wood that they used in here. You can see the beams, the floor and the top. They would put hay above this, and along with the rest of the barn area. But this area was set aside for grain production. And as you can see, as I said before, there was a doorway here that went outside. So this is the other one I'm looking down over. This was the back side of the barn there. But this was something that was absolutely necessary, because whether they were raising cattle or horses, had mules, raised chickens, they had to grow their own grain. And a lot of times it was not so much corn as it was wheat and rye. The corn production, this part of the country early on, wasn't as major as it is now. Now all the farmers around here basically grow corn and soybeans because you can make the most money on that. But back in the day, there were a lot of other smaller seed grains that they used. Certainly wheat, certainly rye, certainly some barley, I suppose. Some of it might have been used for food grade for people, hauled in bags to the mill and get it milled into flour. But the rest was just kept whole and then just fed to the animals, and they thrived on it. It wasn't a scientific thing, but it worked. So let me come out here. I'll show you one more feature here, and then we'll. This farm had 2 built-in ladders here to take you up to the upper level. Now the reason that they had the upper level, as you can see the beamwork and the planking there, this was additional hay storage. Now, especially after the era of hay bales, I can remember a few years when we had a heavy hay crop that the other 3 bays were full, but we still had some hay, so we would put it up in this, these balconies, if you will. There's one here, and then of course there used to be one on the other side. There's just a few beams left from that. But you can see just how heavy the construction was. If you look over in there, you can see what I was saying about him putting the rough cut 2x in there to try to reinforce the framing. How necessary it was, I don't know, but he, like everything else in the old days, it was always overkill, and he was old school when he was trying to do it also. If you look up in there, you can see there are 2 sets of chains up there with a pulley. Remember, back then they didn't have power equipment. They didn't have hoists. They didn't have other ways to lift things. They had to essentially use block and tackle. And I'm sure that's how some of these heavy-duty beams got up as high as they did. They were too much for people to just lift. The rafters there might have been light enough that people could have worked them up there, but these cross members certainly were way too heavy to try to do much with in that regard. I'm sure there was a way that they could, lift some of them up into place before the roof went on, but they would use a block and tackle to try to, move heavy objects like that, and it worked very well. Most people don't know what a block and tackle is anymore now that we have hydraulics, but depending on how well they were built or how many loops they had determined how much weight you could actually bear. So at any rate, just to look at the spine of the barn, these little holes that were cut in the top is when they redid the roof. They put vents in up there so that there'd be more way for the heat to escape. You didn't want the barn to get too hot when it's full of hay because you didn't need any barn fires. So having airflow is important. So they try to improve it that way. Certainly when the hay was put in a clump with the hay hook, it wasn't packed as tightly as a bunch of bound hay bales tied with baler twine and then stacked tightly together to get as many in as possible. So it was more of a risk with a fire that way. So they wanted to make sure there was plenty of ventilation. So, okay, let's go downstairs and we'll take a quick look at the stable. Okay, I'm down in the stable now. This wall right here with this major beam would have been where the original barn, the wall that came down to the floor, ended. And then these beams coming out here about another 4 feet, that was where the cantilever was. And then out here was open. The doorways into the stable would have been below this beam to the various stalls. It's been reinforced quite a bit over the years. When my father came in here and did work, he replaced some of the wood with steel beams, but you can sort of see here what the original wooden beam supports look like. I think these are original, I believe, unless he replaced them, I'm not sure. But another thing that I wanted to show you here that's kind of impressive is you can see the size and thickness of these floor beams here that held the floor up. They had to hold tons of hay. And again, let me show you with my hand, get a rough idea of the size of these things. They're about 6-8 inches by maybe a foot, and these were logs that were just squared off. They didn't completely bother to saw them. You know, the edges are still round there, they're raw edges, because it wasn't necessary. But they needed them to be level so that they could, you know, put the floor on and it would hold, and then also down below here. The main carry beam for the entire barn, oops, okay, we got plenty of junk down here, is right here. You can see as it goes from one end to the other. That's a span of about 70 feet altogether. And if you look closely here, you can see where it's spliced. It was actually not one, but 2 logs. 70 foot log was big, even long, even for back then. You don't want it to taper. You want it to be about the same diameter all the way through so you can have level floors. And again, the same thing. It's a rounded log. It's just a peeled log on this side, and then the top and bottom has been squared off in a sawmill saw. But that carried the entire weight. Now what my father did, of course, is he put this heavy duty steel post in here to make sure that it would be supported. My son painted it a few years ago, and if you look back there, there were more of them. All the red ones were here from the late 50s when he started to work here. He had done work here in the old part of the barn before he added those additions on. And then what was also done, they had to do a lot of concrete work because originally this was dirt floor, but he tried to set it up so that he could have manure troughs here. The cattle stalls were like to the right here of that, and then they would scrape the manure away from the cattle into the troughs. The original plan was, and he had it laid out perfectly, to put a barn cleaner in here. You can see that's why there's this turn here, and then it goes around there. There was a machine, I forget the name of the brand that was big, but it was a barn cleaner. It was kind of a chain with paddles that would rotate all the way around, and then it would go outside of the barn, up a chute, and then it would dump right into a manure spreader. So basically all the farmer would have to do is scrape the manure off the back of the stall into the gutter, and when it got full, turn the machine on and it would carry it right out to the manure spreader. That's long before the days of the government trying to regulate manure and manure pits and certain times of the year you can use manure or not. Before all the environmental kookiness took over, that's the way they did it. Now, unfortunately, my father never lived to see this completed as far as that went. We had it in here a number of years. The concrete was done a number of years before he got sick and passed away. But after he died, of course, we never had the money to try to put the barn cleaner in. So when we had cattle in here, and we did have cattle in here Let's see, he died in 1968. We had cattle in here probably through my younger brother in the late 80s. So these manure troughs were used for manure, but what we had to do is shovel it out by hand using wheelbarrows and then a ramp into the manure spreader. That was one of the jobs I had growing up. Once I got big enough and strong enough to do it, it wasn't fun. You had to do it at least 3 times a week. It was a messy job. You wore your rubber boots, of course. But it had to be done because you couldn't just let the manure pile up in here. Here is just a rough idea. Most of the stalls have been removed, but you can see here they had the metal in between the cattle, these partitions, and then they had these metal, we used to call them drinking cups. The top part has been taken off of there, but it was basically a pressure valve that the cow would push down their nose on, a piece of metal, or nothing sharp. It was a broad, flat, I forget what you'd call it, a piece of metal. Once they pushed down on it, it would turn the water on so they could get a drink, and then they could always have fresh water. There were drink pipes that were brought to each of these. There'd be one for every other stall, that way any of the cattle that were in there. And then right there was the feed trough. Again, a lot of concrete work to do that, so that they could feed them their grain and then their hay too. And then they also had their chains. I don't know if you can see, these old chains are still there, where they were tied in their stalls so that they didn't wander. We didn't keep our cattle in the barn all the time. Some more modern farms today do, but we would, for the winter we did. But in the summer months when there was green grass growing, we would put the cattle out. In the morning after milking time, they could go out and be out for most of the day. And then when it was milking time in the evening, they were trained to come back in, and they learned where their stalls were. They would step across the gutter with no trouble, and they go right to where they were. You'd snap them up, and they had a chain around their neck, and you'd snap them up with the chain that was there in their stall, and then they'd be good for the night. They could lay down in here at night. They'd, eat and sleep and also poop and pee and things like that cattle do. And then this is also where they would be milked. The pipeline that was here, the vacuum line that was here, is gone, but it was like right along the top of these boards here, these posts. And then they had valves at every other one had a valve so that you could plug the hose for the milker in. They were stainless steel milkers, but they were hand milker, or portable milkers that you take from cow to cow, and they had a reservoir, receptacle, whatever you call it, in the bottom of it that could hold several gallons of milk. So you would milk a couple cows. When the milker became full, and you take it over and dump it into the milk can. We had a strainer and things like that to make sure there was no dirt getting in. And then, of course, when he would take the milk to the dairy, they'd test it to make sure the bacteria count was good and that it was safe for people to drink. I mean, I grew up in the raw milk from this place, and it didn't do me any harm. All this nonsense today with the government wanting to restrict raw milk and so on, it's great. I mean, it has good flavor. It tastes good. You get lots of cream. As long as there's sanitary conditions at the farm, it's probably better for you than the pasteurized stuff we get. Now, if you notice here, the ceiling and the walls are sort of whitish. I don't know what the stuff was actually made of, but we used to call it whitewash. There was a company or people that would travel around doing barns, stables basically, you didn't do it upstairs, for farmers, and they'd have to chase all the cattle out. When they do it, I think they sprayed it on. It's not really a paint per se, and as you can see here, it has eventually started to wear off. I mean, it's been 60 years probably, or 50 some years since it was applied, but it was designed to keep the barn more sanitary, to keep the dirt down a bit. It also adds some brightness to a stable that otherwise would have been, dark in here because they only have a few small windows. Another feature, while I'm here, I'll show you. There were 2 openings to the upper barn right here in this corner. You can see there's a ladder there to get up and down it. That's how you got hay down into the barn. You'd throw it down through, we used to call these the hay holes. And you could fold them. They had a doorway there that you could tip it back or push it down so nobody accidentally fall down it when they were putting hay away. But we just open it up, go up there and throw hay down. I spent a lot of nights after school up there throwing hay bales down so that the cattle had hay in the morning. And there was one here, one there, and then one on the other side. The other corner there had, and it's long gone now, but the other corner had an enclosed room where we had a sawdust bin. We used to empty a dump truck from up top and dump it down a chute, and it would fill that corner of the barn with sawdust because we used sawdust for bedding. It was much more efficient and cheaper than straw, and the local sawmill was 3 miles away at the most, and they had plenty of sawdust they wanted to get rid of. So we'd take the old dump truck over there and they'd load us up and we'd come back, and as a kid that was my job, to have to unload that truck full of sawdust. It got easier as I got older, but originally it was quite the job. It took quite a while. And then when I was younger, I remember I must have been maybe 5 or 6, it was my job to actually fill the wheelbarrows with sawdust. I had a shovel, and my dad would park the wheelbarrow right at the entrance to the the sawdust bin, and I'd have to fill it. It was too heavy for me to lift and push. He'd take care of it from there, but I had to fill it, and that was one of my jobs. And what he would do is he would dump the pile of sawdust sort of in the center here, right by the post. And then when the manure was scraped away from the cattle, you'd take a scoop or two of sawdust and sprinkle it where the concrete was there to provide them dry bedding. And that's how we cared for the cattle. There were times when we may have used old hay or straw, but if we could get sawdust, that was the preference. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can really tell you about the barn. It's just an amazing structure done by people who didn't have a massive education, but they knew how to do things. They were just farmers. They weren't college educated, they weren't engineers, but they knew how to do construction, they knew how to do carpentry, and they built something that has endured here over a century and a half. And it's just amazing to me that this is still in the shape that it's in. I mean, we've tried to do some things here. We've added electricity, of course. There was some electricity in here when I was a kid, but not much. I've added a lot more. And it's been run down because it hasn't been used as a barn in a long time. It's, like I said, it's mostly storage now and kind of a workshop. You've seen some of my other videos out in the cinder block or the concrete block addition where I do work out there on the equipment. But this was the main focus of the farm. This is where the food was produced. This is where the cattle were stored and milked before the days of a lot of milk cows in here. Back in the 1800s when my ancestors had it, there were a bunch of horses and mules in here. My great-grandfather had a pair of draft horses. I've seen old pictures. My grandmother said they were called Charlie and Fred. One was white, one was dark. Before that, my great-great-grandfather I saw one old picture probably from the early 1920s. Must have been an 8-mule hitch on a wagon that he had. That's unbelievable to me. But if he was hauling heavy stuff, if they needed him for logging or hauling grain, I mean, maybe they needed that many. I don't know. But that was the history here at one time. We had a shed that's no longer here, that there were probably 50, 80 old horseshoes just hung on a rail there. And when we was kids, we used to love to play with them. They were no longer used. They had been worn out. That's why they were put there, or they had been thrown by the horse or mule that had them. But that's the way they did things back then. So I hope you've enjoyed this. It's a little different than I usually do, but it's amazing to me that my ancestors could build this and that it stood this long and is here for my use today, and hopefully it'll be here for my children or grandchildren's use too, depending on what their future may be. So thank you for coming along on this journey with me. Thank you for watching, for liking, subscribing, supporting our channel as we live out in the country on a shoestring.